Antonelli has been one of the rookies that I think social media has shouted about the most, saying that he was overrated and that Toto's made a bad decision and all of these things, only for him to come to Brazil and then people go, oh, who's this guy? I genuinely think that Antonelli has actually done a pretty stellar job this season. I just think that there is a ton of variables against him, and I think one of the biggest ones is expectations. Let me explain. This video is brought to you by checkmythumbnail.com, the analysis tool for YouTubers by YouTubers. Try it free today. So look, Antonelli hasn't been brilliant if you are purely comparing him to his teammate, which I'm about to do in a minute. And I'm sorry if you're an Antonelli fan, because this is going to sound brutal, but bear with me. But I think a lot of it is down to expectations. But I'll explain that a bit later on. Let's first of all talk about how Antonelli has done so far. Obviously recording this straight after or close to the Brazilian Grand Prix, which he had a great weekend for. But Russell, his teammate, is fourth in the championship on 276 points, which seems like a massive gap to Antonelli, who is seventh in the championship on only 122 points. Russell clearly the winner in points, and when we look at the race head-to-head as well, it's also 2-19 in favour of Russell finishing ahead of Antonelli, which is just a wild stat. In terms of the sprint races, it's 1-4. Again, Russell massively outdoing his rookie teammate. And in qualifying, it's 21-5, which is pretty bad. And the average gap doesn't make it any better. It's 3.5 tenths, 0.363 seconds to be exact. So it's quite a bit. I mean, it's a brutal stat picture. But again, I don't think it really tells Antonelli's story here. It does, but I'll explain. But there's been a good arc here. We can see that some progress has been made. And I think from the very start and from his rookie season, we know that the potential is there for Antonelli. Look, in qualifying in the first race, he was out in Q1, started back at the grid, came through to P4 after the 5-second penalty was overturned. But this was a race where people were spinning out, where people were crashing. You had Hamilton, you had Leclerc spinning. Just, a wild race. Sainz crashed out, for example. Alonso crashed out, for example. I know Alonso's a rookie as well, but still. But it kind of showed this kid has something. It was his first, appearance, as a rookie, very young, 18 years old, just an absolute mountain of pressure on top of him at essentially a top seat. It's not really, is it? But, it is. And I think he did a good job. Then he got the podium in Canada, his first podium, and then he managed to get the sprint pole in Miami, all singled out by James Allison as, highlights of what is to come from this young driver. Unfortunately, though, he was very inconsistent during that time. And then even more so than that, when that inconsistency was highlighted, it started to pile on as this kind of mid-season slump came in. So the first thing to note here is that James Allison has even admitted that they took the car in kind of a wrong direction. Russell has complained about this as well. And Antonelli very much became a canary in the coal mine for testing some of these things and so on, and suffering most when the car got tricky. Not so much that he was the one who was given the new upgrades to test, but that, he really needs kind of a stable learning platform, and Russell is an incredibly adaptable driver and he's used to dealing with these sorts of things and giving the right feedback and so on. So that's just going to make it much, much harder for Antonelli than it would have for Russell. By Belgium, he had slumped to P16 at Spa, his worst weekend, and it was 6 out of 7 races in the mid-season with no points. Car's harder to drive. Rookie has low confidence. The experienced guy, Russell, is basically killing it, with these upgrades. Doing an amazing job. In Zandvoort then we get to, and this is kind of the low point for Antonelli, but he's running well up to P6, but collides with Charles Leclerc, ending Leclerc's race, then speeds in the pit lane, gets 2 penalties, drops from battling for strong points down to P16 again. And Toto Wolff calls his year so far a mix of brilliance and frustration. And I believe it was at Spa as well, in between those 2 weekends, that basically Toto Wolff said his performance was simply underwhelming. And it seemed like the excitement had kind of started to fall away. Mercedes themselves had admitted that they think that all of this went back to kind of last year with his FP1 in Monza, where he crashed early on. And then the team had basically told him to drive slow and not crash at the start of the season. And for a guy like Antonelli, who's just raw talent and quick, they should have really done what you do with a Colapinto or a Max Verstappen. You just tell him to put the boot down and learn from every mistake, you know? And they admit that was a mistake, and they stopped doing that kind of at the midpoint of the season. And we can see then that while it took a while, he started to come back, you know, late recovery. So Mercedes also finally had a better car direction by the end of the season. Russell wins from pole at Singapore, his second win of the season. Antonelli finishes P5. And while the P5 doesn't sound great, Antonelli was much closer to Russell in terms of race trim pace, which is a good thing when, you know, Singapore is where Russell is winning. So that's important. The issue is still his qualifying and just staying out of trouble. So then in Brazil, Lando wins, but Antonelli finishes P2 and frankly shows what he can do. Not only did he outqualify and outpace Russell all weekend, as well as in Mexico, winning there too, over Russell in the Grand Prix, I forgot to mention. But the point is, in Brazil, he did such a good job, not by his pace. I always kind of knew that was there. I think all of us did. Not even by, you know, the managing the race, staying out of trouble in the sprint when others were sliding off. He was the one behind Lando and so on. For me, the biggest thing was this shows a rookie who has gotten much better, gotten more comfortable, all in the moments where Verstappen was hunting him from behind. It's not even that he kept Verstappen behind. You could make so many arguments about, you know, offsets in tires, different race pace, dirty air, all these different things. It was about car placement for me. And yes, you know, him pushing Max into the dirty air was impressive. But more impressive was just Max is a guy that every driver knows lunges, and better drivers than Antonelli, namely his teammate Russell, who I know had an issue with his car, to give him credit, would dive into free air thinking that, you know, Max is going to take a lunge and then put themselves offline in order to defend against Max's lunges. And by defending against Max's lunges in that way, even if Max isn't going to lunge, you then put yourself offline and you open up a lunge from Max. Not once did he move. You know, the last time I remember seeing someone do that kind of thing was with Alonso and Sergio Perez. Maybe not to that level, because Alonso was literally changing his lines every single lap, keeping Perez guessing. But it was a brilliant, brilliant performance from the young rookie against a guy that you know is hard to keep behind. Keeping Max in your mirrors is not easy. So I think that was really, really impressive. So, like, I think we're seeing an improvement on a big level. And this is what brings me to why the stats, for me, are important to put in context, right? The thing we need to bear in mind is, first things first, yes, he doesn't look as good as the rest of the rookies. Bortoleto has looked spectacular. Bortoleto's probably the best rookie for me. I know some would say Hadjar, but for me, it's because he's making Hülkenberg look bad. And that is not easy to do. Hülkenberg is a spectacular racer. If you don't think that, I think you should go watch some more old F1s. You know, Hülkenberg is spectacular. So Bortoleto's look great there. But then if you look at the rest of the rookies, they've all done a good job. But also their benchmarks aren't that high. Like Hadjar has Lawson, crippled Lawson, and when Lawson has kind of started to come back to his own, he's giving Hadjar a run for his money. You know, he really is. Colapinto's had Gasly, and as I said, Colapinto's a weird one as well from where he came in, and he's not been rated any higher. Behrman has been doing an amazing job, but look at where he was at the start of the season, but look at him now compared to Ocon, you know, and he's being rated very highly this season. Antonelli isn't, because of how he's doing against Russell. But Russell is certainly an even better benchmark at the moment than Hülkenberg is. So you've got to give him that. More importantly, though, I think the problem here is just expectation. I said this at the beginning. My biggest issue with where everyone's rating Antonelli is that basically everyone was rating Antonelli, waiting for Antonelli to be You knew Max Verstappen, the guy that was going to come in and win, his debut race or win one of his first races. But I think that's unfair because, for example, Max didn't win his debut race. A lot of newer fans seem to think he did because it was his first race with Red Bull Racing. But, Max took a year to warm up as well. He made a lot of mistakes in 2015 in the Toro Rosso. He showed pieces of brilliance and he deserved that step up. But I think that, it's a completely different situation. Max got some time to warm up in the secondary team without that ton of pressure on him. I think Max would have done well anyway, but the point is he had that time. So everyone's expecting him to come into this high pressure situation in a Mercedes up against a guy who we all say is probably one of the closest behind maybe Charles Leclerc to Max Verstappen and do a spectacular job in that situation. He's also told not to crash by Mercedes at the start of the season. Look what that did to Franco Colapinto, who we know is very fast. So our expectations were, this is the next Verstappen, this is the next Lewis Hamilton. He's going to come in and absolutely destroy everyone in his season. If we didn't have those expectations, this would have been a pretty decent season with some dulls and some highs. A great season by any rookie standards, even compared to Piastri, who came in with a similar kind of thinking around him. It's just expectations is my point. In reality, he's done a very, very good job, I think. And I think Russell should be concerned because I think if you give this kid another year to warm up, given the trajectory he's on now, and you're going to new cars that Russell hasn't sat in either, so it's a level playing field to learn from. While I think Russell should and will beat him next year, I think this is a kid who's only 18, 19 now maybe. He's coming up. So I think if you just forget about the expectation for a minute and talk about just rookie seasons, while the stats don't kind of give the credit with just the head-to-heads and so on, I think you have to reason it's been a pretty damn good rookie season. If you disagree, let me know. Subscribe. Oh, and before you go, if you enjoy automotive content, I am trying to revive my Car Nerd channel. There's going to be new weekly episodes on it, and you'll see the links at the end screen. So if you could please subscribe, help me get to 1,000 subscribers. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.